Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Over the last 24 hours, we have seen another wave of additional Russian cruise missile attacks upon Ukraine. We estimate that between 30 and 40 Russian cruise missiles were launched against targets throughout the Ukrainian state. Now, what's interesting in this latest round of cruise missile strikes by the Russians, normally speaking, the Ukrainians report incredibly high amounts of these being shot down. Sometimes they report up to 90% of these cruise missiles being shot down by the air defense forces of Ukraine. In this specific attack, the Ukrainians are reporting about less than 50% were shot down. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the Russians are starting to adapt to what the Ukrainians have done in terms of their adaptation in the current conflict by being able to shoot down some of these cruise missiles? Now, we don't believe that the Ukrainians are shooting down 90%, possibly even 50% of these Russian cruise missiles. We do believe that the Ukrainian air defense capacity has increased. It was degraded early in the war, and then the Ukrainians started to mobilize. They expanded their air defense forces. They started to get more air defense systems in from Western countries, and there is a whole host of air defense systems, some of which have been publicized, some not so much, that are now active throughout Ukraine, including the ground-launched AMRAAM that is being used. And that was provided by Norway, and in all probability more have been sent by the United States as well. But in this recent attack, the Russians continue to go after critical infrastructure, going after the ability of Ukraine to fight war, while at the same time targeting the morale of the Ukrainian people as well by trying to shut off the light and power and what have you. But it's interesting to see now that in all probability the Russians are starting to use countermeasures and different systems, either electronic warfare types of systems, to jam and degrade that Ukrainian air defense capability. And that's probably what we're seeing right now. We continue to see very, very heavy fighting in the east. We have received reports, and this is coming directly from the head of Wagner, that they are no longer receiving troops from the Russian penal system. And in all probability, it appears that they may be withdrawing from areas near Bakhmut and some other areas. Look, ultimately, the Russians are not going to win this war on the backs of a private military contract organization. At a certain point, the entirety of the conflict, which it started out that way, was on the back of the Russian ground forces, the Russian VDV, and then we saw this transition to PMCs and predominantly the Wagner group, and we saw the rapid expansion of Wagner, and they continue to be used in the conflict. I think the Russians at this point understand that they're going to have to conduct large-scale maneuver operations on the battlefield. They're going to have to maneuver. They're going to have to launch large-scale armored attacks, mechanized maneuver assaults at various locales along the line of contact. They're going to have to break through Ukrainian lines. They're going to have to conduct enveloping operations in order to be successful. Ultimately, Wagner is an organization that is made up mainly of light infantry personnel. We have seen that in Bakhmut. We continue to see that in and around Bakhmut. Obviously, there is heavy fighting continuing to take place. The some of the heaviest fighting is taking place in very urban, built-up, house-to-house, street-to-street fighting in Bakhmut, and that's ideal for Wagner. But again, the Russian military has that same capability. The Russian army has its Spetsnaz formations, which act more like elite light infantry. They have their airborne forces, the VDV, again, acting both in a mechanized role, maneuver role, and as light infantry formations as well. Russian naval infantry and the ground forces of the Russian Federation have that same capability. Now, the Wagner forces, in all probability, were more experienced, especially some of their more elite units from fighting in North Africa, Libya, Syria, and various places in sub-Saharan Africa. And those forces have performed well in some scenarios. But ultimately, as we see the prospects of large-scale maneuver operations, that is going to be conducted by Russian ground forces. At a certain point, the Russians, if they're going to seize Bakhmut, they're going to have to surround Bakhmut, cut Bakhmut off from Ukrainian supply lines, and then take the city. Now, ultimately, these frontal assaults by Russian infantry formation, house-to-house fighting that is taking place in Bakhmut is going to start to wear down both sides. This is incredibly bloody, hard fighting that is taking place. And it would probably be more prudent for the Russians to conduct maneuver operations against the Ukrainians, meaning come in, cut off Chasiv Yar, cut off the ability to supply Bakhmut, cut it off, and that would be it. And we anticipate that's going to happen. Again, I think what we're seeing right now in this reported spring offensive, this slow-moving offensive that we're seeing right now by the Russians, I believe this is more of a large-scale reconnaissance and force. They're probing the Ukrainian lines. They continue to do that, but more importantly, through the use of heavy artillery, through the use of airstrikes, through the use of cruise missile strikes, they are wearing down the Ukrainian military. How do we know that? Well, we know that right now at least, it looks like the Ukrainians don't have the ability to perform a great deal of maneuver operations. A lot of the equipment that was used by the Ukrainians in these two offensives, one near Kharkov, two, the other one on the western bank of the Dnieper River, really treated the Ukrainian formations. They took a lot of casualties in those operations. Now, they're not widely publicized. And obviously the Ukrainians, in terms of their propaganda arm, discuss about how many casualties that they inflicted upon the Russians. And the Russians likewise. Now, you don't hear about that too much in the West, but again, especially in some of the operations that took place in the kind of the northeastern quadrant of the west bank of the Dnieper River, up in here where my cursor is circling. The Ukrainians took tremendous amounts of casualties going over this open area through minefields and dealing with what was Russian battalion tactical groups, and more importantly, better quality Russian forces. The VDV were operating in this area as well, and they were able to degrade Ukrainian forces. And we saw that in the north as well, near Kharkov. Obviously, the Ukrainians were able to take significant amounts of territory, and it was a successful offensive. However, again, because it was an offensive operation by the Ukrainians against, in certain areas, dug-in Russian forces, they took casualties, and they took equipment casualties. We've seen video footage of this taking place, so we know it happened. So, again, that has degraded the Ukrainian ability to conduct maneuver warfare. At the same time, we are seeing the Russians continue to mobilize, continue to produce equipment at a rate that eventually they will be able to conduct renewed offensive operations, probably on a greater scale than what we even observed in the early stages of the conflict. But right now, that is why we're seeing the Ukrainians really beg and plead for these armored vehicles from the West. They're sending their troops to Germany, to the United Kingdom, and various locales to receive training under the protection of NATO, train those troops up. We are receiving reports that massive amounts of equipment from the United States is heading towards Western Europe. It is being, as we speak, is being offloaded in Western Europe. So eventually that equipment is going to make its way to the Ukrainians. Now, therein lies the issue with escalation. At what point will the Russians take direct action against some of these crossing points near Poland? Because that's where these vehicles are going to come through at, or possibly Romania. In all likelihood, those tanks, those armored vehicles, are going to come through Poland. And that's where the risk of escalation starts to raise its ugly head, especially as we go into summer. But again, I think we'll continue to see the status quo. Wouldn't be surprised if we do see larger scale maneuver operations by the Russians, and then ultimately culminating in a late summer operation by Russian forces on various locales, even quite possibly in the direction of Chernihiv and or Sumy. We continue to hear discussions out of Belarus as they continue to prepare for what could be war. But again, the Belarusian side is saying, look, we're only going to enter the conflict if we are attacked. But what does that mean? Difficult to say at this point. So we will continue to monitor. We will continue to report. Thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.